The Global Briefing Series is an occasional series of speakers in which we bring prominent speakers to the campus of Oklahoma State to help us understand the rest of the world, to help us understand and gain insight into the trends, the events, the issues, the conflicts that really are shaping our world today. I'm particularly pleased tonight that the School of Media and Strategic Communication partnered with us on tonight's event. The School of Media and Strategic Communication, as you know, is one of the strengths of OSU's academic offerings, and I'm delighted to have all the students from SMSC here tonight. And it's an appropriate thing because our speaker tonight has a lot to say to you. So again, welcome to the first global briefing of our of this academic year. I'm going to ask Dr. Joey Sennett to come up and give an introduction to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce our esteemed speaker tonight. You've probably had the opportunity to read his bio. Our flyers have gone out for weeks now. But I wanted to add briefly some of his comments, his thoughts, relevant thoughts on journalism over the years. So I went back and looked through some of his writings. And for example, in 2001, he had already been working as a weekly columnist in the Middle East for some 30 years. He started as a reporter editor at the Daily Star in Beirut. And in his last column before going off for a year to a university journalism fellowship in the United States, he shared with his readers what his thoughts were and his goals had been for that column. And he said that his very narrow goal was to offer readers a combination of facts, analysis, and opinion that would entice them simply to think about the issue that he had raised. And he wrote, "I do not claim to be right or to offer sacred truths. I do not expect to change the mind of readers who disagree with me, but I do hope that they might take a moment to think about the issue from the perspective I offer. I see my responsibility and task as promoting discussion rather than waging a weekly battle and a long-running ideological war." And I wish that there were more media today in the United States who took that approach. And on another point, as we as journalists in the United States worry quite a bit about attacks on our profession, we can look to our speaker tonight for some perspective. He has noted that the dangers a journalist faces in the Middle East include active wars, guerrilla and militia groups, state violence, terrorism, foreign military occupations and armies, political intimidation, and the power of mass media's public opinion. Writing for the Neiman Reports, he had said that at that point his 35 years of experience had led him to believe that the greatest form of courage that a journalist can display in his or her work is to affirm universal standards of human rights and dignity by confronting and challenging the power of the government. And I'll leave you with one last quote here from him, talking about the courage it takes to be a journalist, especially in the Middle East. He said, "They are often the first to make public demands of the state, challenge its use of power, or suggest a better, more humane style of public life and political authority. Their courage derives from their willingness to make the first move in tightly run societies, to be first to challenge authority to the public, to point out that the emperor is naked and that the citizens are human." And yes, good journalism is good journalism around the globe. And I am sharing these words with our multimedia journalism students so they will find inspiration to go out and do good journalism. And I believe and I know that we will find inspiration in his words tonight. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Khouri. Come up and speak about experiences in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Joey, for that introduction. Thank you very much to all of you for coming out here this evening. And special thanks to the Oklahoma State University School of Global Studies and Dean Randy Kluver and the Media and Strategic Communication School for hosting this. and special thanks for whoever made those amazing little hot dog rolls out there, which gets everybody energized. So in the time I have, which is maybe 30, 35 minutes, I'll speak so we have more time for discussion, because I learned from your questions and your comments, and I want to make sure we have a lot of time for that. So I basically want to give you some thoughts and analysis based on my now 50 years of experience. I started as a journalist in 1968 at Syracuse University, where I was studying and at the same time going back and forth in the Middle East and writing. So I've been writing as a journalist and a print journalist predominantly. I've done other stuff, but the other stuff's not really journalism. I mean, journalism is only print journalism for those old timers like us. But I've done TV and I've done radio and I've done multimedia and film and stuff, but I'm still at heart a print journalist, a reporter, a columnist, and I've had 50 years of experience covering the Middle East, and most of it also writing for people in the United States and in Europe. I've done work with people like the BBC, CNN, National Public Radio, Washington Post. So I know the world of Western journalism well from my studies and my work, and I know the world of Middle East journalism. And they're both going through very difficult phases in terms of journalism. But I want to just make one comment about a positive element in the interaction between Middle Eastern and American journalism, and that is the legacy of a great Oklahoman, the late Anthony Shadid. Those of you who are young students may not recognize that name, but Anthony Shadid was an Oklahoma native who became a journalist and went to the Middle East, and he worked for 15 years with AP, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and the New York Times. He died 6 years ago through a horse allergy incident. He didn't die in the wars or anything like that. But in his 15 years of journalism in the Middle East, writing for the American media, he won all kinds of Pulitzer Awards and Polk Awards and all kinds of awards during his lifetime, and then after he died. And when he died, his papers personal library was deposited at the American University of Beirut, where I work. And I've been researching them and analyzing these papers, and I interviewed 45 people who worked with him, his colleagues, and I've now been producing a small manual for students and working journalists, and I've been offering courses here and there, lectures, about what made Anthony's work so great. And the short answer is that he was and remains the only person who has ever systematically allowed the voices, the sentiments, the aspirations of ordinary people all across the Middle East, Arabs, Iranians, Turks, Israelis, ordinary people, to let their voices be heard in their own words across the seas to reach audiences all around the world. That's what made him so great, and he did it by reporting, spending hours and hours listening to ordinary people in cafes and in restaurants and football fields, and during wartime, during peacetime. He was able to convey to a Western, he wrote for American publications, but in the media, in the digital age, his stuff went all over the world. He was able to convey to the world the voices and the sentiments of ordinary people in their own voices. He was just a conduit, but his reporting was so diligent and his writing was so carefully crafted that he was able to craft stories that read like little novels or poems or short stories. I mean, he was an extraordinary person and somebody of whom Oklahoma should be very proud. And Oklahomans today, especially young journalism students, should pay attention to his legacy and go back and read some of his stories. If you haven't read Anthony Shadid's work, just put his name in New York Times. You'll see the page. When he died, the New York Times put together a collection of his greatest articles and his Pulitzer Prize-winning articles and others. The Washington Post did the same. And I'll be writing some things about him and giving some lectures, which you'll be able to find on the web as well, and I'll share them with you so you can. But I encourage you to do that, particularly you here in Oklahoma. I gave the first lecture on the work I've done about Anthony and what I've learned at the University of Oklahoma a few days ago. So that's just a a little side point showing the role of Oklahoma and Oklahomans in this global communication world that we live in, with its strengths, but in this case, and also some of its weaknesses that we know about. So I want to talk about Arabs, Iranians, Turks, Israelis, and Americans. So that part of the title is to show that there are no people who are blameless in the turmoil and the violence of the Middle East. It's widely shared. All of these people and many others. I forgot to put the Russians in there because the title would have been too long, and the Chinese and the Saudis, and well, the Arabs or Saudis are Arabs, but everybody who's involved in the Middle East, the Europeans, they're all partly to blame for what we have. And then the second part of the title is clarifying major drivers behind the worsening turbulence in the Middle East. So we have a very turbulent period. It's full of violence, it's full of instability, it's full of barbarism, people cutting people's heads off and burning villages and killing people simply because of their religion or their nationality or their sect or whatever. And it's worsening. It's not getting better, it's getting worse, and it has been for a few years. But there's major drivers, there's major reasons for this. Those of us like me who are old enough to remember the Middle East, I went to college in the 60s, so I remember it well. When I started my career in the 60s and early 70s, it wasn't like this before. This is a recent phenomenon. You will hear sometimes on your mainstream mass media by relatively ignorant people, unfortunately, occasionally, who get on the media, who will say nonsense like, oh, these people over there, they've been fighting for thousands of years. That's not true. They haven't been fighting for thousands of years. There's been people who've been fighting on and off for maybe 100 years or so. Arabs and Palestinians and Israelis have been fighting each other for 100 years. The battle for Palestine and Israel continues. Iranians and Arabs have had feuds on and off here and there. They haven't been fighting each other for thousands of years. There's an occasional skirmish, an occasional political contest. Turks and Arabs have some problems on and off. Occasionally Christians and Muslims here and there in little pockets will have a feud and somebody will do something. Episodic, occasional, intermittent bouts of violence, in the same way that in this country you have racial violence, you have violence with immigrants, you have Jews and Koreans and Chinese and Hispanics and all kinds of black and white and all kinds of people who will occasionally get into a clash and somebody will kill somebody. But the vast majority of people in this country are not killing each other. And therefore, you should see the mirror image in our region, which is the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle East, and certainly in the 400 million people in the Arab world, are not killing each other and have not been doing that historically. So there are issues today that have created a huge amount of violence. Some of it is sectarian, some of it is ethnic, some of it is religious, some of it is social, and a lot of it is political and rich and poor people fighting each other for various reasons. And it is all deeply interlinked with the different regional players and international parties. The United States and Russia, Britain, France are the main foreign culprits who have been involved in the last century in the violence in our region. And in the regional players, you have the Arab countries, 22 Arab countries, 400 million Arabs today. And you have non-Arab countries. The three most important ones are Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And all three of those non-Arab countries have been deeply involved in the regional turmoil that we have before us today. So I want to make basically 5 points, like 5 minutes each or so. We've had the modern Arab world started really after World War I. So we've had about a century of modern Arab statehood, from 1918 till 2018 today. Almost exactly a century since the Arab countries were created after World War I. We had about 50, 60 years of uninterrupted, broad, deep, and sustained national development and state building from 1920 till around 1980. At least 60 years of, broadly speaking, uninterrupted national development. Every decade, every generation, people expected and found that it happened. People expected that their children's lives were going to be better than their lives. Their children were going to have better opportunities. Conditions were going to improve. Housing was going to improve. Education, healthcare, water access, jobs, incomes, security, whatever. And this was the dominant situation from the 20s till the 80s. Of course, there was intermittent wars and conflicts. The Arab-Israeli conflict was the main one that occasionally blew up into a war, and then things got back onto the development path. The Cold War between the Soviet Empire and the American-led West translated into little proxy wars. In different places, you had American allies and Soviet allies fighting each other occasionally, or at least politically contesting each other. But broadly speaking, we had 6 decades of serious development until around the 1980s in the Arab countries. And this is when problems really started to happen. You had several factors: price of oil, the end of the Cold War at the end of the 80s, population growth being faster than economic growth, economic mismanagement of the countries by governments in the Arab world that had mostly become military-run, family-based, security-anchored, non-democratic, non-elected, unaccountable, and often incompetent and uncaring governments that had full power. And therefore, this developmental momentum of 6 decades, gradually, starting in the 1980s, stagnated. And as populations became much bigger than population growth, continued to outstrip economic growth, per capita income started to decline. So the Arab population today is 400 million people. In 1930, it was 60 million. We've gone from 60 million to 400 million in whatever that is, 80 years or so. And the economic development, which was almost totally dependent on central government management and funding, simply could not keep up. By the 1980s, there was a huge amount of corruption. Governments were controlled by military officers took control of most Arab governments. So you hear names like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, Omar Hassan al-Bashir in Sudan, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak, Anwar Sadat in Egypt. These were all military officers. They weren't very good military officers either. When you look back, their work in defending their countries was not very successful, unfortunately. And they were terrible governors of countries. They were not trained, and they were not able to manage entire countries politically. So you ended up with these kinds of countries run into the ground by these kinds of regimes. Now, there were other forces that were responsible for the decline in the development of the Arab world. 2 principal ones that I talk about: the incompetence, the corruption, the uncaring and incompetent management of our countries by our own Arab governments as the central issue, because that's what organized day-to-day life, and the currents of development or de-development, or issues of equity, issues of justice, issues of sustainability. All of these were determined ultimately by the local people who ran these countries. That is central to the regression that started in the 1980s. But there were 2 other huge factors that contributed to it, so as not to put all the blame on the Arabs. One of the reasons that this happened, that the Arab governments were so poor, was because you had the Arab-Israeli conflict, which started really in the 1930s and reached its peak in the 1940s. And the consequences of the Arab-Israeli conflict have been and continue to be enormous for the stability and development and state building of the Arab countries. In fact, many of these military regimes, many of these incompetent military rulers who took power because they were saying that the Arab world is threatened by Israel, which is what most Arab people felt. And they said, only we, the army, can protect our national interests, and therefore we have to run these countries. So that there was a direct link between the Arab-Israeli conflict and the assumption of total power by Arab military regimes. So the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Arab countries started spending billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on defense, that was not well used, and they couldn't defend themselves because every time there was a war with Israel, the Israelis usually won for various reasons. And the third factor, which is linked to this, is the fact that Western and Eastern military interventions in our region, starting by the Europeans, recently by the Americans, more recently by the Russians, the Iranians, now by the Turks, and the Israelis as well, non-Arab military intervention inside Arab countries has been going on not just for the last 10, 15 years, not just since the beginning of this century, since Napoleon, 220 years ago. There's been 2.25 centuries of almost uninterrupted foreign military intervention inside our countries. Imagine if you have 2.25 centuries of Russians manipulating your electoral system, as they've been doing recently. They've been doing it for 5 years, and you're all worried, and as you should be. Imagine if this goes on for 2.25 centuries. Well, that's what's been the legacy of the modern Arab world. So the situation, the second point is that this has led to the fragility, the stagnation of development has led to the beginning of a process that I call the second great fragmentation and reconfiguration of the modern Arab world. The first great fragmentation and reconfiguration happened during the birth of the modern Arab state system around the end of World War I. And that's when these Arab countries were created. Most of them were provinces of the Ottoman Empire. There were no borders between them. Then the region was divided and countries were created: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Tunisia, etc. So that was the first great fragmentation and reconfiguration of the region. What we're seeing now, I believe, is the second great fragmentation and reconfiguration of our region, which is now underway, and we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know what the new configuration is going to be, but all we can say is that this is now underway, and the process is happening because of the issues I mentioned, the three issues I mentioned: poor Arab governance, Arab-Israeli war and its consequences over 70 years, and nonstop foreign military intervention, which is worsening, by the way. If you look at what's happening now, if you just look at Syria this week. The Turks, the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians, the Saudis, and the Israelis, everybody is in Syria trying to get their piece of the cake or protect what they see as their interest. The foreign militarism is getting worse, not getting better. But along with those three, there's a new factor, and this is what I'm calling the major drivers of the current turbulence. And these drivers today came about because of these situations that I mentioned, this historical situation. And the drivers are simply the fact that a once integrated, coherent Arab world, all the people, the 22 Arab countries, who were different countries, but they all thought of themselves as Arabs. They all felt they had certain common identities. They all spoke Arabic. I mean, an Arab is somebody who speaks Arabic. Who says they're Arabs. That's what an Arab is. They can be a Tunisian, they can be Moroccan, they can be Egyptian. But the Arab world was once a world. They were coherent, they voted together, they worked together, they helped each other. That has shattered. There is no longer an Arab world. There is only now an Arab region, a region populated by Arab people, but those Arab people have lost the integrity and the unity, and I would also add the dignity that was a prime that were prime elements of their identity and their statehood. And the facts of that fragmentation and disintegration of this integrity are basically that all the major sectors of life, of modern life today, since the early 1980s, that critical turning point I mentioned, all the major sectors have been deteriorating. Economic growth, poverty, unemployment, access to water, education quality, healthcare, environmental protection, every single major element of life, including things like corruption, freedom of expression, accountability, the rule of law, whether it's material things like water access, jobs, income, or political things like freedom of expression, accountability, justice, rule of law. Every one of these, without exception, every one of them, across the board, has been deteriorating gradually, stagnating and deteriorating over the last 40 years. The book I'm working on now, which will be done in about a year or so, has identified initially about 60 different elements, what I call dysfunctions, and no publisher is going to accept 60 dysfunctions, so I consolidated it into 25 dysfunctions. So my book is going to talk about 25 different elements, but they all fit together because they're all linked. And I'll give you just 2 or 3 examples because we don't have time for more than that. But all of this stuff is you can read about it on my website. If you just go to my name, ramikhouri.com or ramikhouri.com, it takes you to the website in North Carolina, of all places. That's where the syndication agency. So who was it that went to North Carolina? That's right. But you were at North Carolina or Duke?
No, North Carolina.
North Carolina, okay. Yeah. Well, Syracuse is now in the ACC, so boo to both of you.
Turbulence here.
I know. So this is a little bit more. See these tribal conflicts? They're terrible. Actually, that's in Greensboro, so that's another world. But the website of the syndication agency that syndicates my articles and columns and stuff has all of this stuff on it. But I'll give you just a few examples. What I mean by this. Let's start with, well, poverty. Poverty has been increasing all over the Arab world. It ranges generally from around 10 to around 50%, depending on the country. Some of the countries that are at war now and completely messed up have poverty rates of 50, 60, or 70%. Yemen, for instance. You have poverty has been extensive and increasing in most of the region. Now, I use words like most of the region because it's not that the whole Arab world is like this. Well, I'll be telling you about education and water and jobs. It's not that every single Arab is living in misery. But the situation today is that a majority of Arabs, over 50%, are living lives of stress, dysfunction, inequity, poverty, suffering, and chronic vulnerability. And it's being passed from generation. We're now into the 3rd generation of families that can barely have enough money to meet their basic needs every month. This is documented now by survey evidence. When we used to write this 20 and 30 years ago, it was based on observations and what we thought we saw. Now there's survey evidence by serious scholars in American universities, Gallup, University of Maryland, Michigan, Princeton. There's something called the Arab Barometer. If you're interested, go just the Arab Barometer and you'll see this incredible surveying of the Arab world. And very credible Arab pollsters who have done surveying of the entire region. We have evidence now that around 75%, it goes from 70 to 80, it varies. Around 75%, which means about 3 out of every 4 Arabs. In other words, this quarter of the room are fine, and this 3/4 of the room are all in poverty and stress. An overwhelming majority, about 75%, cannot meet their basic monthly expenses or can just barely meet them but have no savings, no social security, no insurance, no backup social safety net. And if the bread earner of the family breaks his or her leg and can't work, the family immediately plunges into poverty. 70 to 75% of the Arab people are living in this condition. You don't hear about this because the media doesn't show you poverty. They show you rich sheikhs in Abu Dhabi with golden toilet faucets or something like that, because this is mediagenic. This is sensational. You don't see the poor people of the Arab world because, like all poor people, they're invisible. They're not seen. The media doesn't talk about them. In the 1950s, in the 1940s and the 1950s, the American media didn't show you poor black people or poor Hispanic people or even poor white people. They just don't appear in the media because by nature of the political systems, they're invisible people until they rise up and assert themselves. Poverty is a huge issue, and poverty means vulnerability. These are people who are living right on the edge, and these ratios have been worsening since the 1980s. In the 1980s, probably if you looked at the Arab world, you'd probably find that most of the people were in what we call the middle class. There was a small group of very wealthy people and a small group of poor people, but the majority were in the middle, and they were essentially middle class, lower middle class. They weren't living in such distress because the populations were so much smaller and the governments and other private sector could take care of people's needs. Education. Surveying test scores, universal testing of primary and secondary school students show that almost 50% of middle primary and middle secondary school students cannot read and write and cannot do basic math. This is also universal testing, which you can find on various websites of testing services. These people there's about 75 million young people in primary or secondary schools across the Arab world. About half of them, 35, 36 million people, are doing nothing in school. They're going to drop out, or they're going to finish school, they'll graduate with a diploma, but they don't know how to read and write, they can't do anything. And therefore, you end up with a mass. And when I say mass, I'm talking about 40, 50, 60 million people in the next 3-4 years who are going to drop out of school or graduate as illiterate and be able to do nothing other than clean a car window or wash dishes or carry sacks of potatoes or something like that. Donkey work, because they'll be treated like donkeys because they do the work that donkeys do. Or robots. They clean windows. Robots here in the US, a robot cleans your car. In the Arab world, a robot, which is a human being, cleans the car because that human being can't do anything else. They can't read, they can't write, they can't think creatively. They've never been allowed to think on their own. So you have these massive numbers, tens of millions of people who are every year leaving the school system. And therefore, what that means, and this is partly what explains poverty, is that about 60%, and I'm always saying about or around because the figures are never conclusive, never authoritative. The government systems either are not able to document these things or they are lying. They don't tell us the full truth because it's so embarrassing. But about 60% of people who work are what's called informal workers, informal labor. An informal worker is somebody who works for $2, $3 a day equivalent in the local currency. They're hired by the day mostly. They don't have health insurance, they don't have pension, they don't have maximum working hours, they don't have minimum pay, they don't have social security, they don't have unemployment benefits, they don't have any protections, they don't have a contract. Mohamed Bouazizi, the seller of fruits and vegetables in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia in December 2010, who set himself on fire, and that literally sparked, figuratively and literally sparked the Arab uprisings. He was an informal laborer. He sold vegetables and fruits every day to make $10 to afford to let his brothers and sisters go to school and his mother to to stay alive. And if he didn't sell his fruits and vegetables every day, the family had no income. And when a police lady came and somehow abused him, she wanted a bribe, maybe she wanted free food, she wanted something, and she took his scales away, he couldn't work. She prevented him from working, and he went to protest to the local governor. The local government office completely ignored him because he was an invisible man. He didn't exist, he didn't have rights, he didn't have a voice. He didn't have any legal protections. They ignored him, and so he went and set himself on fire. We don't know why, because he died. But he was an informal laborer, people living right on the edge. And about 60% on average of people around the Arab world are informal laborers. And it's partly because of the lack of quality education, and it's partly because of the lack of the ability of the economy to generate good quality jobs. So education, poverty, inequality, we are the most unequal region in the world. A recent report just came out called the World Inequality Report. It's online if you want to see it. Scholars from different countries studied the whole world, and the Arab world was the most unequal region. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a small number of people was far greater than what 60 or 70% of the rest of the country had, of the population had. So water access, 14 out of 22 Arab countries are extremely water deficient. There isn't enough water for people's basic needs. You go across the board, healthcare, housing, public transportation, corruption. These are all measures of material life standards. When you take the political into consideration, freedom of speech, democratic participation, holding power accountable, none of these things exist in any Arab country to any appreciable degree, except a little bit in Tunisia now, where they've created a democratic system. And then all of these things together, and there's many, many others across the board, create a situation now where we see that 400 million Arabs do not comprise a coherent Arab world. There's an Arab region with 4 different populations. And I would argue that about 60%, that's my estimate from this data, about 60% are poor, vulnerable, and weak, and with no political rights whatsoever. That's a majority of people. Around 25% maybe or so are middle class. You'd call them middle class, they have a job, maybe they're school teachers, maybe they drive a bus, maybe they work in a bank or the government, and they probably have some kind of insurance, so they're okay, they're not wealthy, they're not poor, they're middle class. But it's only about a quarter of the people. About 10% are fabulously rich or just wealthy. They're professional people, lawyers, doctors, engineers. They mostly earn their wealth legitimately, and a lot of them earned it through corruption. But the point is there's about 10% of the Arab world that's very well off. They have a Mercedes, a BMW, et cetera, et cetera. And about 5% of the Arab world, I would argue, are people in the Arab world. They live there in the Arab region, but they're not of the Arab region. In other words, these are people who have pulled out of the system. They have exited the Arab system, the Arab economy, the Arab political system, the Arab cultural system in many cases. These are people like refugees who have had to flee, young people who've immigrated. There's been hundreds of thousands of the brightest young people who've left the Arab world and have immigrated. And some of them are probably here in this room, and some of them are all around the US, and they're including my 2 children who are in the US, and they just leave because they see no future for themselves. And they take with them the brightest young minds of the Arab world that should help us build our countries. And some of this 5% are people who pull out of the system. They join a terrorist group, they join a tribal group, they go join a political militia, they find some group in society, a religious group, a cultural group, that gives them the protection, the opportunity, the identity, and the voice that they don't get from being citizens in their state. And therefore, we have now this fragmented Arab world, and this leads me to the last 2 points, quickly, the fourth point is that the situation in this context is that the central governments of the Arab countries have contracted. The central governments have slowly stopped providing services to the entire society as they used to in the 20s and 40s and 50s and 70s. Now, central governments don't have enough money, there's too many people, they've lost legitimacy, and therefore central governments serve maybe half the country, 3/4 of the country, whatever, and then all these other people find succor and assistance and opportunity and protection somewhere else, and they find it in religious groups like, say, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a predominantly nonviolent, peaceful religious movement. They find it in militant groups like Hamas or Hezbollah. Some go to terrorist groups like ISIS and a few others. Very few people do that, but people find their life outside the structures of citizenship and the state, and they find it in these other groups in society. And this has this opened the door about 20, 25 years ago, especially after the Cold War ended. This opened the door for all this penetration inside our countries, which has now resulted in the single most dramatic and dangerous movement, which reflects the underlying drivers of the worsening turbulence, which is the penetration of our countries by regional powers and foreign powers. Regional powers, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, are probably the most significant in different ways. US, Russia, Britain, France are the most significant internationally. There's others as well who get involved. And each one of these is a little bit different. But so what you have now is sovereign Arab countries that are slowly losing their sovereignty. Countries that could not provide their citizens with the rights and expectations of citizenship, jobs, income, equity, justice, rule of law, opportunity. And they could not provide their countries with the protections of a sovereign state. And they've been allowing all these other countries to come in at will. They come in and do whatever they want. They attack, they set up a base, the Russians come in, the Iranians come in, the Israelis come in. Now Arabs are doing it to other Arabs. The Saudis, the Emiratis, and other people are going from one country to another with their military. And this has opened the region to this terrible condition that it's in now, where there's more violence, more turbulence, and more desperate citizens trying to figure out what do they do to just stay alive. And we don't have the answers to these questions. People are ad hoc now trying to figure out, if you look at northern Syria today, people are trying to figure out, should they get close to the Turks? Should they get close to the Americans? Should they stay with the Syrian government? Should they get Iranian help? Should the Russians help them? It's a very, very bizarre, unusual situation. And then into this situation, you get the new policies of President Trump in the United States, which is very interesting new element to the mix. And the new policies of the United States are quite incomprehensible to most people in the Middle East because they're not consistent. So Trump has said he wants to leave Syria, and he recently, last week, said no, he's going to stay in Syria. The United States now has a little military base in eastern Syria, and the initial reason for the US military involvement in Syria was to defeat ISIS, which is a legitimate effort. And many Arab countries were involved, in Iranian countries, Russians. Many people were involved in trying to defeat ISIS because ISIS needs to be defeated. The criminal terrorist acts they were performing are unacceptable, and the US was part of that process. In fact, led it in the beginning with its airstrikes in the summer of 2014 and 15. And now, though, the United States says it's staying in Syria because it wants to keep the Iranians out. So the great new focal point of regional tension has become the Saudi-Iranian confrontation, or the Israeli-Iranian confrontation, or the American-Iranian confrontation. And you now have the United States trying to work with Israel and the Saudi Arabians to create a united front to push back Iran. Whether the American accusations against Iran are accurate and true remains for history to tell us. My own perception is that given what we've seen in the last 40 years of American government accusations against Arabs and against Iranians and against Saddam Hussein and others, that some of these accusations are true and many of them are not. And we just can't judge right now. I don't think that Iran is the great menace that the American and the Israeli and Saudi governments make it out to be, but Iran certainly needs to be engaged in a serious way so that it does not produce conditions in the region that are either threatening to countries in the region or to the United States. Whether Iran actually is that threat or not is not clear. The American government will tell you every day that it's the biggest sponsor of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see the evidence for that. Neither do I see Iran as a benign, peaceful, lovely, happy polo player. So the point is that the confrontation that's going on now between Iran, some Arab countries, Israel, or at least some Arab governments, because not all Arab people are as worried about Iran as Arab governments are, but the confrontations between Iran, some Arabs, some Israelis, and the United States have become now the central point, focal point of much of the diplomacy in our region. And this has complicated these underlying drivers that I mentioned of disintegration of social structures and fragmentation of economies and fragmentation of entire countries, because you have now a decaying of the countries from within and external pressures because of these ideological battles that promise to threaten some of these countries as well. The last point I would make is that this is a pretty gloomy overview. I think most of it is accurate. It is what I have seen happen. I've lived through this process and I've watched it, and I know Iranians, I know Israelis, I know Americans, I know all these people. I've interacted with them, I know government people. So this is my honest observation of how the trends have been going and where we are today. The good news, there's two good newses. The good news, number one, is that we know how we got here. We're not dealing with an act of nature or an act of God. We're dealing with the consequences of policies created by political leaders who have made bad policies. Year after year, decade after decade. Arabs, Israelis, Iranians, Americans, Russians, everybody has a share of the blame. So we know how we got here, and we can see from the underlying fragmentation, education, water, labor, poverty, rule of law, we can see the issues one by one. They can all be fixed. There's many other countries in the world that had poverty, that had corruption, that were fixed. So these are fixable problems. The second good news is that we have an example of how to address the Iranian, Arab, Israeli, American tensions, and that is the Iranian nuclear agreement that was signed and that the American government recently pulled out of. That nuclear agreement was one of the great achievements of American diplomacy, and it was a rare case where American perceptions of and interactions with the Middle East were based on logic, reason, facts, and more importantly, two critical elements that we must figure out how do we bring them back into the picture. Treating everybody equally. Every country, Israel, Iran, Jordan, whoever it is, every country should be treated with the same respect. And number two, the movement towards a resolution of these conflicts must be anchored in internationally accepted law and legitimacy. The Iranian nuclear agreement did both of those things. The Americans treated the Iranians with respect. The Iranians responded with respect. Both sides made concessions. They reached an agreement. The UN approved it. The world approved it. And the threat of any potential Iranian nuclear weapon, which is an accusation that is not fully proven, but it still was an important accusation, that threat was gone. Now we don't know. We'll have to see. So there's bad news and there's good news. The bad news I mentioned, the good news I mentioned. The question is, which direction are we going to go? I would close by saying it's up to people like us in the media, in universities, in civil society, in the churches, the synagogues, the mosques. It's up to us to make our voices heard. We can't leave this process to the whims of political leaders in all of these countries, many of whom are incompetent, many of whom are corrupt, many of whom answer to the tune of money that somebody gives them. We can't allow this to happen because the future of our children in the region is already devastated for the next 3 or 4 generations. We don't want this to happen in Europe or Turkey. Turkey and Iran may be next. Israel, Europe, the United States. As you've seen recently, you're not immune to any of these dark forces of despotism and cheating and lying and fake news and all of this stuff and meddling in your election. You're not protected by a great golden shield around you. You're just as vulnerable as we are. It's just you're a little bit further away. But the Russians have already indicated, well, you may be far away, but they know how to get to you. So it's critical that institutions of civil society, education, media, and others stand up now and first of all demand from their own governments, you from yours, mine from mine over there, demand accurate information, better answers, better policy, and most of all, a commitment to interaction with each other based on treating each other with respect and equality, and treating each other based on the rule of law and international legitimacy. And with that, I say, go Cowboys, beat Boise State. Thank you.
So earlier today, you were interviewed by our president, Burns Hargis, who asked you how Western media, particularly American media, did in covering these issues. And your answer was terrible, right? Mainly terrible.
Totally terrible.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us and tell us what do you think are the systemic or the other issues that contribute to that poor performance?
Sure. I think broadly speaking, most of the global media have done a poor job of covering the Middle East. I don't know if this is universal. I don't know if the global media has done a poor job of covering China or Chile, but I know the Middle East because I follow that closely. And the American media has done the worst job of covering the Middle East. And the reason for that is several. First of all, the media is primarily a commercial beast. The media is a business. They want to make money. They're not a charitable society. So they tend to cover events that are either entertaining to their readers or viewers, or sensational or exciting or dramatic or whatever. The media has become polarized, ideologicalized entertainment more than anything else, whether it's from the right or from the left. There's very little media left in the center, very little. And that's one reason. So they tend to focus on the dramatic and the sensational, or they just ignore most of the issues. The second point is when they do cover issues, they have two main weaknesses in the US, in the mainstream. There are exceptions, but they're very few. An occasional writer for one of the quality newspapers, an occasional great documentary on TV. But broadly speaking, they have two big weaknesses that I've seen. The first is they don't give context to what's going on. So you'll read a headline in the local paper, as I do when I'm traveling around the country. Palestinians die in clashes with Israelis. And they have a paragraph, and you don't know that these people have been fighting for 60 or 70 years, or that the Israelis occupy Gaza or lay siege to it, or the Palestinians sent a rocket into Israel. That you don't get this full background of why these things are happening. So you just assume these are Middle East people because of their genes or their religion or something. They just like to kill each other. So it's totally decontextualized, out of context. And the second reason is they tend to focus on the dramatic, the violent, the unusual. So I will ask you, in the next year, look at your media, whatever media you follow, online, TV, papers, weekly magazines, whatever you follow. You tell me a year from now, how many times have you seen coverage of events in the Middle East, like this event here, where people are sitting in the university talking about issues that matter to them, openly discussing sensitive issues, give and take, just normal people trying to address the challenges of their society. My guess is you will almost never see it. But the reality is that it happens every single day. In universities, in community centers, in churches, in mosques. Not many synagogues left in the Arab world. There's a few here and there, but it happens in all of the institutions of our societies. Because the people in our region are exactly like the people here and the people in California. Maybe not California, that's a different world, but let's say Wisconsin or something, or North Carolina or so. But you don't see normal people. So I told you that the poor and the vulnerable are invisible. In fact, the normal are invisible. Normal Arab people are invisible. The media doesn't show them. They're not very exciting. They're not very interesting. They don't sell newspapers. So there's a third element which is a little bit more controversial and tricky, but it is an element that we have to deal with, which is politically motivated ideological bias. Whether by the American government, by lobby groups in Washington, by foreign governments, you have people who deliberately try to promote a certain kind of coverage of the Middle East that is not fair to all the players in the Middle East. It tends to be more pro-Israeli and anti-Arab. It's increasingly anti-Islamic. It's increasingly anti-immigrant. And the bad guys change over time. Used to be anti-communist. So there is that third element, but the first two, I think the structural ones are more significant.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open it up now. If you're speaking from the back, then I'm going to repeat your question so we can capture it on video. Those of you on front, I'll hand you the mic. So we've got a question right back there. Yes.
Kind of a follow-up question on the media. I guess going on the point that you made about how poverty is invisible. Because it's unsensationalized. That's essentially what I'm getting from that. Because media doesn't cover it.
Right.
And on the converse of that 5%, is that an accurate number, the 5% that's off the gridish that decide to go into these groups?
Well, that just leave the systems of the Arab world. Yeah, it's my estimate, but it's around there, yeah.
So I guess because it's touching on exactly what you talked about just now, about the idea of, boring Arabs, and the normal people that actually exist. How do you fix, this is an open-ended question, and it's probably not even a brief one. How do you fix media to focus on normal behaviors of, and focus on what really needs to be addressed, like the poverty, rather than the sensationalized 5%.
So let me summarize your question, because we need to catch it on video. Very complicated question, but essentially it boils down to, look, the media system does focus on the sensationalistic. It focuses on the dramatic. How do we begin to maybe raise our expectations of media so that it does help us to understand the realities of the Arab world?
That's a good question, and there's really two dimensions to that. First of all, if the United States or England or China only want to show Arab terrorists or Muslim fanatics or whatever they think is the dominant issue in our region, they're free to do that. But they can't do that and at the same time send their armies every 5 years and create chaos as they have done and provide billions of dollars of funds to Arab autocratic regimes that put 40 and 50,000 people in jail, as happens in Egypt now. People are jailed just because of their political views, not because they've committed crimes. So if you want to ignore us or treat us as characters, you're free to do that. But you shouldn't also then invade us and help create the suppression and subjugation that we suffer in our societies. The second point is the American media can do good reporting and does good reporting. I would argue that the American media's coverage of, say, Ferguson, after a while got pretty good, and Baltimore, and places where you had serious issues of racial tension or killing or injustice, And it's still happening. Black people are still being killed the other in Dallas, and the media follows this up much better than it used to do when I was a kid in the 1950s, when black people didn't exist, except as characters on cartoon shows on Saturday morning. But so the American media covers migration issues, I think, much better now than it used to do before. The Trump election opened the eyes of the media to discontented white people who, for some reason, found Trump as their salvation. Whether they were poor, whether they were afraid of migrants, whether they didn't like Muslims, they didn't like Hispanics, they were afraid for their jobs, all these different reasons. But we know about these things now because the media has explored these issues in much greater depth and nuance. And it doesn't do any of this in the Arab world, with the exception of an occasional in-depth report by one reporter in one newspaper once a year, or something like that. This is where Anthony Shadid, the great Oklahoman, was different. Anthony did this every other day in his reports. He let the voices of these ordinary people speak for themselves. He turned invisible people into front-page spokespeople. It was extraordinary. It's extraordinary what this one Oklahoman journalist did. He set an example, I think, for the whole world. So it's not something that can be changed easily, but it can be changed. And I think one of the critical things is for journalism schools and universities and media institutions to address these issues. And consumers need to demand better coverage from your own media. The consumers, the public, is being treated like idiots, broadly speaking, when it comes to foreign affairs.
Rami, several years ago I was in Beijing in a meeting of all the foreign correspondents covering China. And it was a room much smaller than this with a crowd probably a third of the size. And what struck me about that is a region of 1.3 billion people was being covered by essentially 20 people who all knew one another, all went to dinner together, all went to drinks together, and they were feeding each other certain narratives. And that helped me to see just how limited a viewpoint we had on China. Based on your experience, the people you know, does a similar situation exist in American media towards the Middle East? We just don't have the people.
Well, the United States mainstream media have pulled out of the Middle East, with the exception of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Essentially, NBC News now covers the Middle East from one guy in London. It's incredible. And of course, if there's a war or something, they might send somebody to fly in, spend a few days and fly out. So CNN is there, but most of the mainstream media is not there. NPR is there here and there. So the US mainstream media doesn't pay attention to the Middle East. And this is another issue which I didn't mention because of time. We have made ourselves, I said that we have surrendered our sovereignty to a large extent all across the Arab countries by our own incompetence and these other reasons of foreigners and Israelis I mentioned. But we have also become the world's first dispensable region. The whole Arab region is dispensable. It doesn't matter to anybody. So it's not that we're invisible people, it's that we're an invisible region. We don't count. We don't matter. By and large, I exaggerate a little bit to make a point. So the Arab world is full of extremism and war and sectarianism, and most of the big powers are just trying to make sure that they don't get too many more refugees. So this is a problem because the world, the Western world, the American media particularly, are almost non-existent in the region. Some of them do excellent work occasionally, so you'll get a great feature by the LA Times, the Washington Post. You'll get good journalism, but it's episodic and it's occasional. And it's not seen by more than maybe 100,000 readers who are foreign policy experts. So I imagine most of you in this room who are not Middle East experts, you'll never see any of this really serious, in-depth, nuanced, accurate, comprehensive, relevant, up-to-date, meaningful, good quality journalism. You just don't see it. It doesn't pass across your screens or your desks. So I think this is why the institutions of civil society have to step up. And the media is part of that institution. Now, the media is a business. This is one of the dilemmas. The public media are a little better, NPR is a little better, and public television is a little better, but not many people listen to those or watch those.
Another question? Yes, right here.
I read a really interesting book. I think it was called When Religion Turns Evil.
Oh, by this outstanding author.
I enjoyed it.
When Religion Turns Lethal.
All right. With the two different books.
Yeah.
These
were books
I was surprised.
Charles Kimball.
I was surprised that you didn't, when you were talking about the drivers that were making things worse, that you didn't bring religion as one of the drivers. Can you?
Because religion is a symptom, it's not a driver of problems. The people who turn to religion, first you had Jews turn to their religion to create a Zionist state in the 1920s and 30s. Then you had Christians wanting their areas, and they got it basically in Lebanon. They got power in a state, and the others were minorities. And our family is a Christian minority in Palestine. And then the Muslims, who are the majority in the Middle East, about 95% of the Middle East is Muslim, Arab Muslim. And there's other non-Arabs. You have Kurds, you have Druze, who are other religions, but their religion is not a source of radicalism, violence, and turbulence. Their religion served them, I'm generalizing, the Muslims turned to their religion and politicized it, and in a few cases radicalized it, and in a very, very few cases militarized it as a desperation in reaction to these conditions, this century of dehumanization and degradation and invisibility that I described. You had always small groups of Muslims around the Middle East in the 30s and the 40s who were saying that we need Islamic societies, we need Islamic states, but they were not big violent movements. If you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, if you look at the movement of poor people in South America, if you look at this anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, if you look at the Buddhist monks in Southeast Asia fighting their oppression, in every case, they turned to religion in the final analysis to organize, to mobilize, and to push back against the oppressive systems that degraded them. So religion is every person's last resort for justice. And if God doesn't come to your help, if religion doesn't get you what you want, you have two options. You emigrate. Some people leave. They say, the hell with this. I'm fed up with it. I'm going to go to Venezuela or Australia. Some people do that. Or you turn to violence and terrorism. You say, the hell with this. I'm going to blow this whole place up. And some people do that. So you need to, and this is one of the problems that the media here has accentuated by not contextualizing the role of violence, the place of religion in public life, and the link between the two. There was some of the early people who carried out terrorism in the Middle East. Jews and Christians were among the earliest terrorists in the Arab world and in the creation of Israel. In the 30s, you had Zionist groups sending letter bombs to kill British people. And then you had some Christians who were Palestinian Christians like George Habas and people like that who were hijacking airplanes in the 70s. And so everybody, it's not a question of Muslims, it's a question of desperate people who turn to their religion and sometimes militarize it. So I think this is a really important point. And if you look at the number of Muslims who turn to violence in the in the Muslim world, I would argue, and this is not a scientific survey, but it's just my gut feeling from living through this, it's about the same proportion as American Christians who would go and blow up abortion clinics. So you have Christians who are terrorists, or Timothy McVeigh, which you know well here. There are Christian terrorists, but there's very few of them. And there's Muslim terrorists, and compared to the Muslim world, 1.4 billion people, there are a handful. But they tend to get the most publicity because that's what they want. And in a way, the media is falling into the trap of giving them what they want. So I'm not saying that Muslims don't do violence, they do. But we should put it in the proper context. And get rid of the underlying drivers, and they stop doing it.
Yes.
You mentioned some American papers. What do you think of The Economist? It's a British magazine. They cover foreign affairs.
I think The Economist is historically a very good publication that regularly slips into colonial nonsense. They become very colonial when Britain is involved. Their coverage of the Gulf War, their coverage of Argentina is very colonial. But they can't help it. They're British. I mean, that's what makes them. So they're a colonial power that can't get over the fact that they're not a power anymore. But they're still their attitude. But they're very good generally. So I would argue, read Economist on taxation, read The Economist on the environment, but don't read The Economist too much on wars in the Middle East or things like that, because they're a little bit iffy on some of these issues.
Yes, right.
Thank you very much for the paper. And my conclusion listening to you is that you've presented to us a critical problem, but I don't seem to see the effort in solving the problem, especially when it comes to the media presentation of what is happening in the Arab region. We have government-driven media on one hand and the profit-driven media on the other hand. And both are not actually giving the true representation of what is happening in the Arab region. So my question is, what are the Arab folks doing to tell their stories? Because if I'm not going to give you a good story about yourself, there should be a means or a project or I don't know how to put this. There should be something you have to do to tell your story yourself, so that will be devoid of the way the West or the East will be presenting what the Arab world is. That's my question.
Let me summarize this question briefly. So we have a disjuncture between government-driven media on the one hand, profit-driven media on the other hand, doesn't tell the story. And I think one of the questions you're asking, if I can, is what is the role of Arab media in all of this, and in bringing out a more accurate portrayal of the region?
Well, it's correct. The Arab media are dominated by governments and controlled, and therefore most of them are not very good. And the Western media is dominated by commercial interests and political bias in some cases, and lobby groups, and therefore they have their problems. The true story, the accurate story of the Arab world is slowly being told by some websites. There are some media, by the way, that are better than others. I would argue that Al Jazeera television in English is one of the most outstanding television services in the world, and the website of Jazeera in English is really good. It has its little biases. It's an Arab-run service, but it's quite independent, and it just has really good coverage of a lot of these issues. It talks about poverty, it talks about inequality, it talks about water problems. Other people do this. There's websites here and there. Now, the interesting thing is, you know who does this very well to a certain extent for their own national interest is the Israelis. Much as I dislike what the Israeli government is doing to my Palestinian people, the Israeli government is really good at pushing its story and projecting to the world its viewpoint. I believe that half of what they say is exaggerated or not true, and the other half is true. But they're an ideological power that is projecting news and views and pictures to the world, and they do it really well. Unfortunately, it's not all accurate, and therefore we have a continuation of our problem, because partly it's because they're able to get so many powers in the West, especially now in the United States, to do what they want. So the United States says its embassy now is in Jerusalem, all Jerusalem. The U.S. has cut off funding to the United Nations agency that gives education and health care to Palestinian refugees. And so the U.S. government is doing what the Israeli government wants in some cases. Only recently has this happened in a big way. But it's partly because the Israelis are very successful at communicating their ideological views and convincing the world about supporting them. In some cases, it's based on sheer lies. For instance, one of the great slogans of the early years of Israeli statehood, when they were trying to create a state, and they did, was that they want a land without a people for a people without a land. In other words, they were saying Palestine had no people and should be given to the Israelis, who are people who don't have a land. Palestine was full of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, some of whom were Jews, mostly Muslims, some Christians like my family. And Palestinians, if you go to the website of the Institute of Palestine Studies, IPS, Institute of Palestine Studies, and look at the photographic collections from 1890 and 1920, and you'll see Palestinian lawyers and doctors and people exporting. My wife's family exported oranges from Jaffa to Europe in the 1920s. And I mean, Palestine was full of life and people and vibrancy and people who lived together relatively peacefully. So the Zionist movement that wanted to create Israel said, well, there's a land without a people, we should give it to a people without land. So that's an utter lie. But some things they say are not lies, but the point is they use both, and some things are just exaggeration. So for instance, the Israelis will only talk about the people in Gaza who send an occasional rocket into Israel. These are not real rockets. They're like big firecrackers. They're about that big, and most of them miss their target. The point is, they're little projectiles, and they fired them at Israel, and because there's a war going on. And so the Israelis will only talk about the Palestinians who send these projectiles or send these kites that have Molotov cocktails and trying to set fires in Israel. And they don't talk about the hundreds of thousands of peaceful young kids who are just going to the fence to say, we have rights as refugees, we have international rights that we should exercise peacefully. But the point is that the Israelis are very good at this, even though they sometimes exaggerate and sometimes tell lies. And the Arabs are not. And it's not being done by Arab governments. Some independent civil society groups, websites, others are doing it. And a lot of Arab journalists and people, scholars abroad are doing it with lectures and with symposia and with films. There's a lot of great films now from the Arab world, if you're interested, done by Arabs. But the media is a symptom. We shouldn't focus too much on the media. The media is a symptom of realities on the ground. We should focus on the realities on the ground.
Good. We had a question over here. Yes.
Involving the Palestinian-Israel conflict, there's a lot of confusion about it. A lot of people think it's religious based, some believe it's territorial. What is the reality of that? And is there a possibility of a peaceful conflict where both parties end up happy?
A peaceful settlement?
Let me restate the question. So the question is, there's lots of misperceptions of what's driving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is at the root of that?
Well, do you have another hour? I'll give you the 1-minute answer. The Palestine-Israel conflict is a nationalist conflict articulated in the control of land. There's a piece of land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, from the Golan Heights down to the Red Sea. It's the mandate of Palestine, mandated territory that the British controlled after World War I. The Israelis wanted the Jewish Zionist pre-Israeli state. Jewish groups in Europe wanted a state for the Jews, partly because before the Holocaust, but because of the incredible misery that Jews were suffering in Christian Europe and Christian Russia. It's all the fault of the Christian Europeans and the Russians, for not all of it. So the Jews decided they had to live somewhere normally. They couldn't stay living in anti-Semitic lands. And by the way, if you were a Jew in the United States in 1920, it wasn't very nice either. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. So they wanted to create an Israeli state. They said, let's do it in Palestine. Palestine was a land that was 95% Palestinian Arab. And that's the origin of the conflict. Now, the Israelis were successful for many reasons and created the State of Israel. And the State of Israel is a very impressive place. I've been there. It's a very impressive place in so many ways for Jewish Israelis, but not for Palestinian Arabs, even Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of the state. So the short answer is it's a conflict over land, and it's a political and national conflict. Who has the right to have a state in this land? Who does this land belong to? We feel now the Arabs initially rejected a Jewish state because it was 95% Arab. It's like if I take this room and I say bald people and black people are going to take 3/4 of this room. So how many bald and black people we have? Maybe 7 or 8? So 7 or 8 people are going to take 3/4 of this room, and everybody else gets 1/4. That was the situation. That the Jews who owned, indigenous local Jews who always lived there, who owned around 5% of the land, wanted half of it. And we thought it was not fair. Anyway, that's the origin of the conflict. Resolution, yes, it can be resolved. Either one big state that everybody lives in, but that won't happen probably because the Israelis don't want that. They want a Jewish majority state. They have it, and they want it to stay that way. And the other option is 2 states side by side. It's still possible, but it gets more difficult every year with the settlements. The Israelis have built settlements that have around 700,000 Jewish nationals who have been moved into occupied Arab land. And these are the settlements you hear about. This is against international law. It's illegal under any existing international legal system, but the world doesn't do anything about it. So it can be resolved, but it's really hard. The leaderships in Israel and Palestine and now in the United States, which had a monopoly on mediation, the leaderships are not in any position now to resolve this.
I think we have time for one more question, right here.
Based on what you said, like the dysfunctions that you're putting...
Hold the mic closer.
All right. The dysfunctions that you're writing about in your book, the 25 dysfunctions.
Yes.
Of those, which is like the least harmful and the ones that we can just get out of there real fast?
Fix them fast?
Fix them fast so we can take on those bigger problems later and sort of cause a chain reaction to make it a better place.
That's a very good question, and it's hard to answer because they're all linked. And so as I tried to show you, education leads to unemployment, leads to informal labor, leads to poverty, leads to... So it's very hard to pick one of these things and say, which one should we start with? But I'm asked this question a lot. And I answer people always, I say, there's one critical foundational step that we need, which is to promote freedom of expression. Because only if people in our region can express themselves, can they first of all express their dissatisfaction, second of all, express their ideas about how do we fix this? How can we work together in our countries to fix this? And you've got to have freedom of expression. And third of all, it's the only way they can hold power accountable. So if there's only one thing that we can miraculously change in our region, I would say it has to start with freedom of expression. The next thing is rule of law. You've got to have rule of law instead of the rule of colonels and generals who are supported by foreign countries, which is the case now. And then all the other things can be fixed one at a time.
I was hoping you would say sidewalks, something that we could take. So please join me in thanking our guests. Thank you, Rami, for being here with us tonight.